So, a warm welcome, everyone. This is another global dialogue on food systems resilience, organized by the Food and Climate System Transformation Alliance, in short FACT, at J-WAFS MIT, then Boku University and World Agroforestry in Kenya. Today's topic is really close to my heart. It's land and fragility, right in the middle of a changing climate. Now, my name is Michael House. I'm the co-host of this webinar series together with Greg Sixt, who is the director of the food systems, well, of the FACT Alliance, basically. So why does the topic matter? Why does the matter matter? Well, we are all aware of land and how important it is for life, for agriculture, for livelihoods, for well-being. And we're also aware that we are losing land dramatically. And well, if you look at the UNCCD data, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, for instance, then you would read stunning data. 25% of the world's land is degraded and affecting 1.3 billion people globally. And if business as usual continues, we're going to lose much more of the Earth's topsoil as currently we're currently facing. By 2015, some estimates say up to 90%. And this is not just an issue that we see in dry lands like the Sahel. It's a global challenge. 20% of Europe's land actually is at risk of desertification, especially in southern Europe. We are losing land every day in the US and in Asia through construction and repurposing land. And then the land issue intersects with climate. Droughts and floods become more frequent and having a toll on people. It costs lives. It costs a lot of money, billions of euros in Europe alone, as a consequence of the most recent droughts. Now, in areas with weak buffers, emergencies are often one of the consequences. That's when food aid then comes in, and that's also something we want to debate here, as much as we have a global perspective on that intersection of climate, land, and fragility. So we are really asking where are we heading to with regard to that land climate fragility nexus. Are we doing enough? Are we prepared? And are we doing the right things? And eventually, who is we? Right? Now it's a pleasure that Greg Sixt will be leading this discussion with a distinguished panel. So let me welcome Erin Coughlin-de-Barris, professor at Tufts University. Erin, you have worked with humanitarian teams on early warning systems for disasters, and you have spearheaded the rise of anticipatory action in the humanitarian sector. And you're calling in from Boston. So welcome. Then second on the panel is Hassan Yassin. He's Executive Director of SOCPA and serves as the Chair of Communication, Membership and Partnership for the African Civil Society Biodiversity Alliance. And Hassan, you're calling in from Mogadishu in Somalia. Most welcome. Now, some of you may have seen Alex Aviti from C4ICRAF on the invitation. Fortunately, Alex won't make it today. Now, I'm here together with Sebastian Fiebger, who is working with us in one of our courses at Boku, Environmental Change and Climate Security. And Sebastian, you will be curating, distilling the chats and feeding it back into the discourse whenever Greg feels it's the right moment to do so. Right, so that's it. Greg, over to you. Big questions, exciting panel, and I'll retreat as Sebastian has just done. See you during the closing. Bye for now.
Thanks, Michael. And thank you, Aaron and Hassan, for agreeing to be part of the panels today. So let's dive right in because this is a really interesting topic, and I think that the hour is going to go by very fast. Michael introduced some of the kind of the challenge, setting the stage a bit. I want to build off that a little bit. Thinking in terms of land degradation and climate extremes are one of the key drivers of displacement, with about 23 million people displaced annually due to environmental factors. By 2050, climate-induced migration could rise to over 200 million people globally, with land degradation being a critical factor. And then in fragile states, land degradation intensifies competition over scarce resources, driving 75% of conflicts in Africa that are linked to natural resources. So this ties into actually some back and forth we had with how we titled this session. We went back and forth, and we've called it land and fragility, but it started out as land and conflict, land and climate change and conflict, which I think that's a kind of a bias many of us move towards, right? This climate-induced conflict. So I want to start off with this and talk about this term, and get a sense of from the panelists how you think about these challenges being framed. So I'm going to start with you, Aaron, and then we'll go to Hassan after. So Aaron, the floor is yours.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. Um, so just as a disclaimer, I'm a climate scientist by training. So I'm going to comment here on a lot of things, land tenure, for example, based on what I understand, but most of my research is really in extreme events. Um, so my objection to the climate-induced conflict term is that I think it gives too much credit to climate change when conflict is really very, very, very little influenced by climate or even climate change, in as far as I can tell from what I've been, researching and reading. So for example, in Kenya, for example, pastoralists traditionally had large land holdings, and they would keep some land to be used during the dry season. So it was the wettest land, got the most rain, the greenest part. And so they would graze that during the dry season and graze the other land that's much drier and not as great during the wet season. So when that land was as green as it was going to be. But, over time, a lot of that nice green land that they would save for dry times has been now converted to agriculture or cities, right? Sedentary expansion, and pastoralists no longer have access to that land. So Nairobi, for example, used to be Maasai, very wet grazing area. And so all of a sudden, pastoralist land holdings now look different, and they're much drier on average than they used to be because their wet land has been used for other things, and it's very hard for them to make a living off of that land. So land tenure, I think, here is a major problem. And then of course climate exists, right? Climate is relevant. When you have a drought, that is relevant to pastoralists. But maybe part of the bigger problem here is land tenure and marginalization, and what resources do people have access to manage climate risk. So then if we say, oh, the drought was the problem, it obscures the fact that there are bigger societal issues here about why people can or cannot manage the drought. And so anyway, this is why I get worried about climate-induced conflict as a term, especially if you talk to people who are involved in conflicts. So I think the Syria drought is another example. There was a drought in Syria before the uprising and the civil war. But if you ask there's so many papers now showing that, agriculture rebounded after the drought. And if you ask anybody who's involved in a civil war in any country, they're going to tell you that there were lots of reasons for this, political reasons. I mean, if someone's willing to fight and give their life, they usually have a big list of reasons that's not, and just talking about drought, I think almost minimizes the reality that people are fighting for.
Yeah, right. I mean, we've actually thanks, Aaron. We've actually talked about the Syria example we've prefaced it in class, and it's going to be something we actually talk about in the next session in water. So this is a good primer for the students who are listening. But one of the things we talked about in the intro is just how there's different drivers of the conflict, right? You know, we often try to point to one leverage point or one driver, and I think that's maybe a human condition that we try to point to one thing, and it's a series of drivers. And I want to ask, I'll start with you, Hassan. You know, if we prioritize kind of conflict drivers or fragility drivers or instability drivers, what order would you put those in? If we're thinking about some of the things that Aaron brought up, thinking about climate, we're thinking about kind of these land tenure and social institutions. What kind of what in your experience, Hassan, you know, how would you prioritize those drivers?
Thank you, Greg, and thanks, Erin, for highlighting. From my side, I will say it is vice versa. When it comes to land degradations, for example, now the recent analysis which has been done by the World Bank, it shows that 80% of Somalia land has been degraded. And this was coming
Hassan, you're freezing. I don't normally ask this on a panel, but unfortunately, can you turn off your camera for a bit, and that might help with some of the buffering.
Source of energy production. Regarding to this, excuse me, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, we can now. You froze for a bit, so sorry to ask you to turn your camera off.
Okay, thank you. What I was saying, I was trying to say that it's a vice versa. Both land degradations can directly induce communal insecurity. And the reason why I'm saying the recent analysis that has been done by the World Bank, it shows that when I contextualize in Somalia, 80% of Somalian land has been degraded. And when this land has been degraded as a source of energy production, it has reduced the intensity of the local communities to grow their livelihood, their agriculture productions. And when they lose that fertility, it has driven them to get displaced from where they used to stay to another communities where they did not used to before to stay there. And when they come to, when they combine with that communities, with the little resources that's available, it might not be shareable to both communities. So this can instigate a conflict. In the sense of there, I can agree with Erin. But also the vice versa is true. The climate change impact, such as the drought, is again causing massive human displacement in Somalia. Almost more than 2.7 million people in Somalia are displaced across the country. And the main reason for this, we think, is that it is the drought issues that has been caused by the climate change. And one of the things which can happen and can be as a driver of conflict is that these people who have been displaced will have no livelihoods or might not have other source of income. They might be easily recruited by armed groups to benefit because they are hungry and they want food on the table. And these are the things where I can say this is one of the things that can be a climate-induced insecurity issues. So I will stop there.
Thanks, Hassan. So to unpack some of what we've talked about already, you know, also we're going to try turning your camera back on, but if you start to freeze, Michael will just turn your camera off. We're going to try to make this work. So it sounds like, you know, it sounds like oftentimes climate change can make other variables worse, right? So the land, you know, in your example talking about in Somalia, Hassan, it sounds like if it weren't, you know, there were a number of drivers that lead to deforestation. that makes the land less resilient, which then makes climate change a catalyst for further instability and for further challenges. Aaron, I know this actually ties in well with some of your work focusing on famine risk under climate change. If we think about that work you've been doing on that and where the conversation's been going, do you have any thoughts on kind of this? Can you relate some of your work you've been doing on that to where the discussion has been so far?
Yeah. So maybe following that thread, I think, so we have a paper under review right now, so I'll talk generally about its findings in terms of looking at famine risk under climate change. And so we essentially were looking in this case at cropping agriculture. So I'm not going to be able to comment too much on pastoralism in this case, but what was interesting is if you look at crop models for the future, obviously, if farmers change nothing, if they keep doing exactly what they're doing right now, there are a lot of projections where a lot of agriculture, especially in the lower latitudes, will see decreased yields, right? You're going to see more droughts, more intense heat that stresses the crops, et cetera. However, what's pretty fascinating is if you look across crop types, right? And this is looking at FAO data, crop modeling, et cetera. You can see that in pretty much every region of the world, there are crops that should do fine or maybe even increase yield with climate projections, right? And so when we were looking at famine risk, it became hard to talk about what is the role of climate change vis-a-vis, again, human systems and human choices, right? So I hope the ultimate call to action from this research is really a call to invest in adaptation, in particular in fragile areas, conflict-affected places that aren't receiving a lot of investment, that we say, we're not going to sit back and blame climate change for our problems. We have a lot of control. We have a lot of agency here. It's not okay that that we're going to leave some people behind, right? This is a call to say, with support and investment, adaptation can really make a big difference. And obviously, that doesn't necessarily mean everyone can stay farming the way we've been farming. Adaptation might mean transformational adaptation in some cases, probably a lot of cases, right? We're not necessarily trying to keep, but that there's a lot of potential.
I have to unmute myself before I speak. Thanks, Aaron. So this leads me to two questions. I'm gonna go to Hassan with these broad questions, and then we'll open it up, and then we're actually going to start to shift towards solutions. This is a nice segue. So one is, Aaron, you've talked about research. Clearly I'm based at a university. Michael's based at a university. There are oftentimes barriers in translating research findings into effective policy measures. So Hassan, this is where I'm really eager to hear from you, because you were kind of where the rubber meets the road on this, right? So so kind of what are some of the key barriers to translating research findings into effective policy measures and effective actions? And what might be, so let's start with that, and then I want to kind of unpack that a little bit. So Hassan, in your experience, what has been, in your opinion, what are some of the challenges in connecting research findings into actually, making a difference on the ground? Is that in your okay?
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, this is a good question. When it comes to research, and research mostly is being done by larger institutions or universities, whom might not directly connected to the actual people at the grassroots levels, who are mostly impacted by the land degradations or the climate change impacts, that are losing their livelihoods, whether it is the agricultural sector, whether it is the fishing sector, whether it's also the pastorate sector. The fascinating things that I have found by the research, yes, research has been done, recommendation has been done, but the actual implementation of the recommendation that comes from this research are not being seen on the ground. And one of the challenges that are occurring or preventing these things to be implemented is one is the technical capacities that our local communities require. For example, if they want to transform to sustainable practice of agriculture, for example, the greenhouse issues, how will they construct that one? Where will they get the resources? For example, if they want to maybe deviate from their existing crop growing models, for example, and they want to grow new crops that are adaptable to the climate shocks, where will they get the seeds and who will provide these things? This is another things. If, for example, if they were relying on rain-fed crops and they don't want to monitor that, but use, for example, renewable energies to extract water sources from either the nearest river point of sources or the wells, how will they get these renewable energies on the ground, and who will be provided? So when it comes to the sites, yes, the research showcases good examples, good practices, but due to technical capacity, the financial gaps which these communities are facing, as well as the disconnectivity between the researchers and these local communities, might hinder the implementation of the actual ground. And that's why you will find that most of the national adaptation plans in most of the African countries are not fully implemented at the local level. Thank you.
Thank you. This is Hassan. You set this up really nicely. So this dialogue is part of a class, right? That Michael and I teach. And one thing we hear from the students a lot, and actually we had asked some student, and the week before this, we talked a lot about what some of the questions are. Some of these questions are actually coming from the students. And what we keep hearing is, so how can we overcome this, right? Like oftentimes research shows us many of the solutions that are out there. How can we connect that to on the ground action? And this is, I guess if we knew this, we wouldn't be having this conversation. But I want to ask you both, what, in your view, in your experience, what are some of the ways that we can start to bridge those barriers and address that? So Aaron, I'm going to go to you next, and then we'll go to Hassan on that.
Good question. Well, I think first we need greater investments. We need to see much greater investment and more dollars in adaptation and this kind of work, especially going to fragile and conflict-affected places where people are often reluctant to invest. So I think that's one, is just step up the game. Second, I think sometimes the disconnect between research and action also has to do with perception. So researchers might say, here's a technical solution that works technically in my lab, without really any understanding of why people would or would not choose that solution. And, there's countless examples of this. Like there was a World Bank project. I assign a reading, the class I teach, about a World Bank project in Mozambique. There was some flooding in 2000 in Mozambique, really devastating flooding. So the World Bank invested millions, multi-million-dollar project building new settlements for people, and people didn't want to live in those settlements. And so it was ultimately this massive failure. I mean, this article is scathing. It's a journal, like a peer-reviewed journal article, scathing about how this project was a massive success because no one paid attention to the realities of people who were supposed to live in the homes. So I think that risk perception is a big question. How do people perceive all of the risks that are facing them? So yes, climate is one, but there are many other reasons why you would or would not do a climate strategy that technical people might want to propose. And so one example that I find very interesting is we recently published a paper I can share looking at data about crops planted, an area planted of crops in Lesotho and South Africa. And we were looking to see what kind of macro level behavior do we see when an El Nino is forecasted. So in Southern Africa, El Nino is associated with drought. And everyone knows this. I mean, it's very widely known. It's in all the newspapers when an El Nino is forecasted and then when it happens, et cetera. And that coincides with planting time in Southern Africa. So you should be able to take action. And a lot of the ag advisories tell farmers to plant drought-resistant crops when an El Nino is forecasted or when it's starting to happen. So we look to see, could we see a change in planting behavior? Do people plant more sorghum and less maize in years when an El Nino is forecasted? And the answer is no. But what we can see is that when an El Nino is forecasted, and in particular when the season starts out dry, so the farmers are seeing it happen, they plant less of both. So we're not seeing a massive switching behavior, but we're basically seeing that a lot of farmers will leave fields fallow. And then again, if you look back in the newspapers, it's being talked about. This isn't like a secret. People are saying, we're leaving land fallow because of this El Nino. And so, and it makes sense, right? If you're a farmer with like a marginal plot, you don't want to spend all your inputs on that plot if you don't think it's going to produce in a drought. So the big question to me is, well, then what are people doing instead? If they're not switching from maize to sorghum, what are they doing? How are they making it through the drought? And then as scientists, can we better understand those choices to then help support adaptation and coping to help people get through droughts that builds on what they are already doing?
That is fascinating. I request, so yes, please, if you can, share that paper with us, and also please share the World Bank paper, because I think that would be great to share with the students. I just want to pause for a second. To folks in the audience, we're going to engage with the audience in about 5 minutes. So please send some questions in the Q&A. Along the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button you can push and ask those questions. And then in about 5 minutes, we'll have Sebastian sort through show notes. We have one right now, so please send us your questions. So Hassan, I want to build off of what Aaron said and kind of come back to that question of, how do we better connect research to implementation, to action, to policy? In your experience, what's your opinion on that?
Thanks, Greg. For me, what I will say is that even before we initiate the research, we need to engage with the community that we want to do with this research. That one will enable us what are the viable solutions which the community is already doing to solve the problem. And this will come what we call the locally led solutions, empowering the communities to have their own faith. So when you do this one, what will make us morely for the connection is they will find the common problems together. They will find the common solutions together. Then the next step that which Erin has also spoke about is about the finance. Finance and funding is everything because without finance, even the research will have not been possible to be undertaken. So whatever solutions that has been found together the local community and the researcher, then there should be a financial mechanism in place to make sure that that solution is which is affordable and which is viable to the community is implemented. Thirdly is engaging the local authorities, giving the leadership. It should be like a human rights-based approach and not needs-based approach, because at the end, the governments have responsibility to provide and to take care of their government to their citizens. So we should also, in our research, engage with the government so that they take their ownership, their responsibility to make sure that whatever comes through out that research, together with the local communities and by themselves, will be implemented. And fourthly is to provide the technical capacity required by the local communities so that implementations of the recommendations of the research are put in place. So I will stop in there. Thank you.
Great, thank you both. I want to give Michael a chance to ask a question as well. And just again, a reminder to the audience, please do send your Q&As in there. Oh, they're starting to come in. Michael, do you have a question you want to ask the panelists as a follow-up to what you've heard?
Well, just one for Erin. You've just heard Hassan speaking about the importance of local knowledge and working with communities, and you've worked on anticipatory action and preparedness. To what extent does that actually, Hassan's quest to work with communities, to what extent does that feed into early warning systems? Yeah, and I'm moving back again. I'm shutting down my video, Erin.
No worries. Yeah, I completely agree with Hassan about the importance of locally led decision making and also, giving authority to the lowest level possible in terms of choices of action. So in anticipatory action, the goal is to set up thresholds for action and make sure we're using forecasts. And so the whole point of anticipatory action is to say, we get weather and climate forecasts. We have forecasts that droughts, for example, might happen. Can we make sure we're doing enough with that information? So, so there are a couple of different ways that these have been created. Sometimes it's, locally driven action plans. Sometimes those action plans are at a larger geographical level. And part of the goal here is to make sure that people have the resources and the ability to take action when they get a forecast. So anticipatory action, for example, is strongly promoting cash transfers in when there is anticipation of a drought or a flood, to enable communities to then say, okay, here's some cash, what are we going to do with it to prepare? So not necessarily telling people what to do, but trying to give them the resources to do what they understand to be the right choice. I think there's always there's always a lot of like top down versus bottom up. How do you manage that with anticipatory action? How do you make sure that the planning is coming from the bottom, but that we can also mobilize resources from outside whenever there is potential disaster to support people.
Thanks, Erin. Hassan, do you have any you have a follow-up comment on that, or we do have a question from the audience, but if I'd like to give you a chance to respond to what Erin said as well, Hassan.
No, thanks.
Okay, all right. So hopefully we get some more Q&As flowing in, but there is one I want to address, which relates to the Erin's response, which is even if there were more adaptive seeds to changing climate conditions, how desirable is this dependence on new seeds with no regard to cultural and local backgrounds? Isn't this just fighting a symptom for an instance, but doesn't change a symptom at its roots? So how sustainable can this be? Seems like a very technical approach, right? So this is a question based around some of the criticisms around, we finding solutions, technical solutions, and saying we think this is going to help, and not necessarily being sensitive or understanding or integrating in that local knowledge. So I'm going to let either of you respond. Whoever wants to speak first, just unmute and go. Hassan, Hassan froze. So Erin's nodding. So we'll go to Erin actually, because Hassan's screen froze, and then we'll have him come back.
Okay, perfect. No, I agree. So I think there are two levels here. One goes to my earlier point that, pushing solutions on people from a technocratic approach won't work. So unless we're designing solutions that people see as solutions, they're not going to get implemented and they won't be successful. And that can include seeds. And then I think that the questioner also had a good point about transformational adaptation. So we talk a lot about this in the world of adaptation, that most of what we're seeing right now is incremental adaptation. So we did a big review in the last IPCC report, and what I would call incremental adaptation would be keeping the same farming system in the same place, but maybe slightly changing a variety or slightly changing your planting date. So you're making slight changes around the edges, but you're maintaining a system. And what the questioner points out is that what we really want is, in many places, transformational adaptation that really does change the system itself. Because if we're investing so much in incremental, we might be setting ourselves up for failure, right? If you're telling farmers, oh, just buy some new machinery and plant a little bit differently, and then ultimately, it's really, they can't end up recouping the costs down the road because the climate just isn't working out for what they're trying to do. So I think we really also need to be thinking strategically about transformational adaptation. And I think that should be very much bottom up, where people want to say, I want to transform my community in this way. Communities are always transforming, and do that in a way that's thinking carefully about climate change, and that isn't, of course, imposed from outside.
Right.
Hassan?
I mean, yeah, I just want to follow on this. Like, oftentimes incremental change, or sometimes I should say incremental change, can actually be maladapted because it's trying to maintain the incumbent system, and is not preparing for the realities on that. So Hassan,
Right.
your screen is unfrozen, so I want to give you a chance to respond to that. And if you've got any examples on kind of some of these solutions as well, please, the floor is yours.
Greg, just to hold on with your last word, to avoid maladaptations. In order to avoid maladaptations, then we need to empower the local indigenous. And remember, sometimes climate change impact is huge, beyond the capability of the local communities to solve with their own solutions. For example, if I want, or my community wants to adapt the frequent floods that occurs, that has been either caused by the flash floods or has been caused by the heavy rainfall, then they should be assisted by the government to make sure that yes, these floods will keep continue happening, but how do we construct uh, the suitable dikes or the suitable dams or the suitable water systems so that when these floods occurs, it doesn't do harm to the crops of the communities. So this is one of the things that we should look into our way. That's the floods part. What about if it's a drought issues? Sometimes it is cumbersome for the local communities to just to change their seed, their normal seed grows to new seed grows, not knowing what will come out of that one. Is it going to destroy even the land and make it more worse? So, but what we should encourage is how again the local authorities will take their responsibilities to make sure that they will prepare for the coastal communities, they will prepare for the pastoralists, they will prepare for the agriculturalists, for the drought seasons. They provide the relevant early warning systems, not early warning systems which the communities cannot understand, but a relevant language which my mother at the grassroots level can easily accumulate, understand easily, and take actions effectively, but not just circulating in English way, and it goes around with NGOs which might not be able to transform this one or translate this one into the local language. So that's an again the early warning systems. Then how will the government make sure it has prepared the reservoirs, the water catchments for future droughts? So if we take such precautions with the lead by the local authorities who have the first responsibility to make sure that they provide their citizens with what it requires, then our communities will can adapt easily with the necessary provision of mechanisms put in place and not necessarily transforming their livelihoods into a new ones. Thank you.
Thank you, Hassan. You actually beat me to some of my follow-up questions too. So this conversation is moving in a very good direction. So I want to we've got some input from the audience now. So I actually am going to ask Sebastian to step forward and see if he can extract, challenging task of extracting from stuff that's coming in real time to see if we can come up with one or two questions for the panelists based on some of the audience questions. So Sebastian, I'm going to hand this over to you for a few minutes.
Yeah, so the next question is related to the link of policy implementation and research. Is asking for your experience on how to win the hearts of policymakers to actually consider the recommendation that you get through your research.
It's a good question. I think everyone struggles with this. I'll share one sort of related approach I've been taking lately. So one problem I see in the disaster world is that people, after a disaster happens, we seem to see a lot of political will and interest in that. Like after a big flood, everyone says, oh, how can we prepare for floods in the future? But it's very hard to mobilize that kind of interest before the flood. So, you know, and you can see this happen like after Hurricane Sandy in New York City, all of a sudden, New York started implementing lots of hurricane preparedness. And same thing in California, we did an interesting analysis showing there was a big wildfire in Butte County. And after that wildfire, there were lots and lots of wildfire preparedness policies that were then introduced to the county government. So one question I've had is how can we start to try to convince policymakers to act before the extreme events happen? And so one approach I've been trying recently is simulations. So we've been using, lots of climate data to try to generate extreme events that haven't happened yet, but are plausible. And then trying to get disaster managers and the disaster community to sit down and run simulations of these plausible but unprecedented extreme events to then try to mobilize and really get people motivated to take action. I mean, that political will is really hard. I don't know, Hassan, if you have any other thoughts.
Aaron, that almost sounds like a defense community response. That it almost sounds like war games. Like these simulations almost sound like the wargaming that they do. Yeah. Yes,
and the humanitarian sector does generally do this. I mean, tabletop exercises, things like that. Just like the war games. So the question is, can we try to use that as a vehicle, like something people are a little bit familiar with, to try to mobilize more like people to really visualize what would be the consequences and how do we prepare for that?
And before Hassan chimes in, Aaron, we've had a request to, if you can share the report about improvement adaptation where there's a bottom up. Would you mind, if you can find the link, would you mind linking that to sharing it with Michael or me in our chat, and then we can post it as an answer live to folks so they can download it, provided it's open access.
All right, let me see what I can do.
Okay, thanks. No pressure. Hassan, sorry, I didn't mean to take away from your response, but do you want to build off of what Aaron was talking about? Or respond to the question that Sebastian asked as well?
No, just to highlight on the humanitarian sector. When I contextualize in Somalia, humanitarian has been working almost for the past 25 years, but it has failed to enhance the community resilience, and that's why now mostly even humanitarian sectors in Somalia are focused to development and resilience because they have seen the business as usual has not been working well for the well-being of the communities yet. But things, the droughts continue to happen. People continue to displaced, despite of the millions of dollars that have been pumped into humanitarian sectors. So I leave that one to that one. But what we, as CSOs, we encourage is how our communities become more resilient, more adaptable, and more persistent to the climatic shocks which is happening.
Thank you. Thank you both. Sebastian, is there another question we can draw from the queue? Okay, all right, let's go for it.
Yeah, so it's heading into the direction of participatory management approaches. And it's asked how we can blend local knowledge and document it to become practical and scientific. So kind of participatory management approach, and also maybe you could go for like how should such approaches be designed?
Who would like to take that? Sorry, I'm sharing your paper, Aaron, and I'm struggling
Yeah.
with the Q.
Just to respond fastly. Yes, local knowledge should be documented and should be considered. The only problem which now exists now, researchers or scientists are required to take this one into lab and prove that it is scientifically working. So it is the responsibilities of the scientists to make sure that these local knowledge are integrated into their solutions and prove that it's something that is worthy and which is working, and the local communities have already been implemented. So it is something which should be documented and not necessarily just to be made it's just scientifically, but appreciate that it's as long as it's working in that community, and it is improving that it is enhancing their resilience. It's already a solution that is working in that local context.
Great, thank you. This has gone by fast already. Aaron, please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, no, and just adding, just thinking about that question itself, I think sometimes the approach of trying to document local knowledge to make it scientific is maybe a tough framing. Instead, maybe thinking about how we can enable local knowledge to motivate action without having to necessarily put it into a scientific framework, but like use it in its own framework and respect that that's where it might work best.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. In the last 12 minutes we have, I'm going to turn it over to Michael to summarize, and then that'll lead us to a couple final questions. I wanted to let everybody know I accidentally deleted the question in the Q&A about requesting the papers, so I put them in the chat to everybody that Aaron shared. If panel attendees, if you don't see those, just ask the question again for that in the Q&A. I did not mean to delete it, but I was multitasking, and clearly our brains aren't very good at that. So, Michael, I want to hand it over to you for a minute to summarize kind of where we're at, and we'll go from there.
Oh, thanks, Greg. And Aaron, Hassan, you're asking me the impossible, but let me share what I understood. I mean, we started off with that big question whether climate change leads to conflict, and what I understood is that we overemphasize conflict overemphasize climate as a driver of conflict. Yet I sense some agreement that climate can act as a catalyzer of social tensions and contributes to already existing fragilities. Then I sensed an agreement that adaptation is needed as well as preparedness, obviously. But there seems to be a disconnect between, what we know and what research and also communities bring to the fore and the actual practice. As Greg, you called this where the rubber meets the road, and you asked Hassan to shed light on that. And there was that kind of agreement. Okay, we are not fully on track here because we probably know more than we actually do. And you may want to respond to that paraphrase if it's incorrect. There's an agreement that we are struggling with funds and money. Right? There are financial gaps that explain some of the disconnection next to most likely mindset issues. But Hassan, you also mentioned that the national adaptation plans aren't fully implemented, and that could be explained through the dollars, Aaron, your words. We need to step up the game, and also work on our risk perceptions. And you mentioned that it's much easier to mobilize the us as humanity, but also political decision makers after a crisis, and not necessarily before. So simulation games and war games kind of would actually help. The question is whether this would also break aid dependencies that Hassan mentioned, and would eventually contribute to resilience building. I think, Hassan, you made that point very clear with regard to Somalia, that after 2 decades of aid dependencies, it's not an easy thing to build resilience and support resilience building in communities. Right, so that's my my take on it. Back to my own big question: no, are we on the right track with regard to preparedness and adaptation, or do we have to be more transformational? Greg, maybe that's a good thing to ask in the closing round. No?
I think that is a great, huge question to close with. So, Hassan, I'm going to go to you first, to Michael's question. Are we on the right track? So, Hassan, I'll go to you, and then we'll go to Aaron.
Thank you, Greg. I think we are not on the right track because remember on the COP negotiations which was happening, when you compare the mitigation measures and the adaptation measures, the mitigation measures had clear targets and had also the clear basket money for each mitigation measures. But the adaptation did not have the target until COP28. But if we to make sure that the new quantifiable and additional funding for adaptation is put in place, and it is honestly being provided by the polluters as polluters principal pay, then we'll be again on track. Because the recently report by UNEP, the adaptation fund which is required by mostly fragile countries that have been impacted by the climate change is huge uh, compared to mitigation. So if we want to successful adaptation, then we need to fulfill our pledges. But the most important thing is also to make sure that we lower our green emissions to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Because if we fail to do that one, then even the adaptation will not be possible. Thank you.
Thanks, Hassan. Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at all the adaptation that's happening right now, it's impressive to see just, I mean, everybody's responding to climate change, and there is a lot of work happening. So I find that encouraging. However, I think, yes, it is insufficient. I agree with Hassan. And so we need more transformational adaptation for sure. I think we need more thinking about unprecedented extremes. So we're not always being reactionary and saying, you know, it's just hard to get people to prepare for something that is really fundamentally different from what they've experienced before. So I think we need a lot more of that in terms of like, are we on the right track? Like what kind of direction I would say I'd like to see more of. And yeah, more transformational adaptation.
Yeah, the unprecedented.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, the unprecedented events actually just kind of rang true. I mean, Aaron and I are both in the Boston area, and the state to our north is the state of Vermont, which in a 2-year period had 2 100-year storm events that, you know, like flooded huge parts of the state. And I think that you really hit a good point about these. You know, are we really planning for these unprecedented events enough? In the last 5 minutes, one thing I haven't touched on yet, which actually we got a few questions from the students about, and was it part of a paper, is oftentimes, or there may be a tension behind, so mitigation measures and adaptation measures often require significant land. And there can be a trade-off of those measures with people on the land and with, you know, communities that don't have as strong a voice as, you know, a solar plant or something like that. to drop a huge question in the last 4 minutes, do either of you have any comments on this how do we find the right balance with mitigation and adaptation measures that might be land intensive and the people who use that land now? Erin, go ahead.
I think I don't. I think that is such a hard question, and I don't have like good advice that would apply to all situations. Maybe.
So that requires a webinar of its own.
Yeah, or maybe I guess my advice would be that like it really needs to be context dependent. Like, we can't be like, here's the answer: solar wins over farms or whatever. But that we need to be, but that in every single case, go with your eyes open and say, okay, what are the trade-offs? Who needs to be at the table, making sure all voices are heard, and that solutions are multifaceted, right? So you're not saying, okay, well, here this solution wins, but saying, okay, what's a package of solutions that are going to meet the needs of all the stakeholders here? So I know that sounds very vague because
well, it has to be, yeah.
Yeah.
But I think also too, and I want to hand it to Michael to close us out in a second, but I think also learning from our mistakes of stakeholder engagement, which often meant coming up with a solution and then kind of through tokenism engaging stakeholders. I think a central element that we consistently are learning, that's a thread that's come through a lot of this discussion today, is that getting people involved from the beginning is essential. Hassan, I want to hand it over to you for a final word from you, and then we'll go to Michael for our close out.
Yes, thanks, Craig. My concern will be only when it comes to land issues and whether it's a mitigation, especially the mitigation. And when you talked about the trade-off, I remember the carbon trading issues, which requires a huge land, and that land people do live in and have a livelihood. So sometimes what happens is that are going to be displaced from that land, resulting to human rights violation issues, resulting to disruption of livelihoods, resulting to disruption of shelters without prior consent or even without telling them what will they get as a compensations. So that would be my major issues, and these things are emerging, especially when it comes to the carbon trade issues in return to climate finance. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both very much. And I just want to tell you how much I appreciate this. Michael, I want to give it to you now to close us out and to bring us to the end here.
Well, I'm echoing Greg. Thank you so much, Erin and Hassan, for this deep and so relevant conversation. It's been fascinating to listen to you from the back, and I once again realized how complex issues are, and no straightforward answer, because everything is actually context specific. Yet there are overarching principles. I think that came out very clearly, and the need for transformative adaptation and mitigation. Hassan, one of your last statements. Now, I want to thank the audience. We have had 60 plus participants. Thank you so much for having tuned in. We will have another webinar on the 12th of December, dealing with water and fragility. And you will visit the FACT website at MIT. You will hear from us on PayPal, a great list server, and on our LinkedIn pages. Yeah, looking forward to the next interaction. Sebastian, thank you very much for curating responses at the back. And yeah, I wish you a good day. Bye.
Thank you. And then one last thing, the recording will be posted. The recordings will be posted on the J-WAFS website. So that's jwafs.mit.edu. You can also find Michael and me on LinkedIn if you have any further questions. Thanks, everyone.